Even with the 20, appreciate you, my guy. They can't touch me. 30 seconds. You saw that. You saw that. Round two, baby.
Wow. Let's talk about recoil.
When most people talk about recoil, they talk about it like something you either get used to or something you're constantly fighting against. In Black Ops 7, recoil isn't random. It's made up of actual stats the game is tracking every time you pull the trigger. At a high level, recoil breaks down into vertical recoil, horizontal recoil, and gun kick. These are values you can see at any time in the Gunsmith's advanced stats. Now this is where things get interesting. Even when you know those stats, they still don't fully explain why some guns feel way harder to control than others. And the reason for that is simple. Recoil doesn't happen all at once, it happens over time. So what really matters isn't just how much recoil a gun has, but how that recoil stacks as you keep firing. And once you start thinking about recoil that way, one stat suddenly becomes impossible to ignore, like a sniper glint staring into your soul. That stat is rate of fire. Rate of fire doesn't change how much a gun kicks per shot, it changes how often that recoil hits you and how much work you have to do to stay on target. So once you start thinking about recoil as something that stacks over time, a pretty obvious problem shows up. How do you actually compare guns? Now that we know rate of fire is a necessary component of recoil, looking at individual recoil stats on their own stops being useful. What you really want is a way to look at recoil as a whole. That's where recoil magnitude comes in. Recoil magnitude is a new stat we came up with that combines the recoil stats you already know with rate of fire, so you can see how much recoil a weapon is actually demanding from your time. And once we look at recoil that way, it becomes pretty clear why recoil takes never really line up. There's never been a clean way to keep everything centered. Let's look at what that means in practice. If you just look at base vertical recoil, the MXR and the AK-27 don't even seem close. On paper, it looks like the MXR should be way harder to control than the AK. But when you take recoil magnitude into consideration, that gap almost completely disappears. Even though the raw recoil numbers are very different, the actual work required to stay on target is nearly the same. That's the moment where recoil stops being a stat and starts being something you can actually predict. Now here's the flip side of that. If we compare the AK to the Peacekeeper, the base vertical recoil is almost identical. Just looking at the raw stats, you'd expect them to feel pretty similar. But once you factor in rate of fire, you can see they're not even in the same conversation. Most players never figure this part out. Not because they're wrong, because the game never explains how recoil actually stacks in that way. And when you look at recoil through that lens, a lot of the confusion we just saw suddenly fades away. But that also raises a new question. If recoil is about effort, then why can you stack recoil attachments and still feel like the gun is fighting you? This is where a lot of builds start to break down. You add recoil attachments, everything looks better, but once you start shooting, your aim still fights back and falls apart under sustained fire. Not because you did something wrong, but because recoil reduction itself doesn't work the way most people assume. What's happening here comes down to the law of diminishing returns. It sounds complex, but the idea is simple. The more of something you stack, the less each new addition actually gives you in return. Recoil reduction in Black Ops 7 works the same way. The first recoil attachment takes a big chunk of recoil off the table, and you feel that immediately. The next one still helps, but not as much. You're not cutting the original recoil anymore, you're trimming the remainder. By the time you're adding a third or fourth recoil attachment, that impact is shrinking fast. You expect each recoil attachment to help as much as the first one did, but the impact isn't the same, and once you understand that, recoil reduction stops being about piling on more attachments and starts being about stacking efficiently. Let's put 4 of the most powerful recoil attachments on the AK-27 and see what happens. Starting with a base vertical recoil of 47 degrees, we're going to first add the compensator, which gives us a 15% reduction. That first reduction is huge, you feel it immediately. Next, we add the control stock, but you can already see it doesn't take nearly as big of a chunk as the compensator did. It's worth noting here that if you're trying to stick to 5 attachments, you can really stop here. Next, we add the recoil springs. They still help, but even here you're already getting less than half the impact you got from the compensator. And finally, we add the accuracy grip, where the drop-off really becomes obvious. You're only reducing the original recoil by 6%, and most players wouldn't even notice that in the game. And when you look at recoil this way, everything starts to fall into a pattern, an actual curve. You start building smart. You put those ideas together and the pattern becomes very clear. A recoil efficiency curve for optimized integrated loadouts. Now that we actually understand recoil, you can finally pick attachments with confidence. Some recoil attachments hit way harder than others, so instead of listing every attachment like an encyclopedia, let's break them down the way players actually build the guns, starting with the ones that almost always deserve a slot. Your first choice is a muzzle, and it really comes down to what the gun actually needs. Realistically, that decision is almost always between the recoil suppressor and the compensator. The recoil suppressor is one of the strongest recoil attachments in the game, hitting both vertical and horizontal recoil at the same level as recoil springs while also keeping you off the radar. The compensator can still be a monster for vertical recoil. On certain guns like the M15 and MXR, it tames vertical recoil more than anything else and gives you the biggest first bite into the recoil curve. But on guns like the AK and the Peacekeeper, the compensator's reduction barely beats the suppressor, which is why I default to the recoil suppressor on most of my build. Now, if a gun's giving you real recoil issues, the control stock is basically the fix. It takes a big bite out of both vertical and horizontal recoil, and the AR trade-offs are so light most players won't even notice. On SMGs, it's the go-to option, and if I only had one attachment slot to calm down a gun, this would always be in the conversation. Now, if reducing horizontal recoil is your main goal, then the Recoil Control foregrip is straight up your strongest attachment. Some guns, like the Maverick and the M15, don't need the help. But for the rest, this is the attachment that settles the gun faster than anything else. But here's where that efficiency curve you just learned about actually comes into play. If you're already running a recoil suppressor into control stock, both of those attachments are already giving you a bunch of recoil control. Adding the recoil foregrip on top of that still helps, but the return is much smaller. Now we're getting into the recoil attachments you only use if you're running Gunfighter or if you're trying to squeeze out that last little bit of control. Recoil springs give you the same recoil reduction as the recoil suppressor, just without the extra benefits of staying off the radar. Springs aren't bad, they're just the lighter version of attachments you're probably already using. But maybe you want something that helps recoil a little while also giving you something else. The mobile recoil foregrip gives you a modest horizontal recoil reduction, but its real value is the movement speed boost it provides. It's not a recoil first attachment, it's a mobility pick that happens to smooth out some horizontal sway. And if you're thinking, okay, but what about long-range steadiness? There's one last option worth calling out. The steady sway hand stop reduces aiming idle sway, which can help you stay steadier at longer ranges, but it won't noticeably change your recoil, so think of it as a stability option only. These last attachments are for situations that call for precision, not raw control. Burst-only recoil attachments, like the muzzle brake and accuracy grip, are basically your gun's first shot hype squad. They help with the opening kick, keep your bursts tidy, and settle the gun between taps, but toss them on a full auto build and they're like, whoa, 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 you're on your own, buddy. The stabilization attachments, the stabilization grip and the stable range laser, are like the Zen garden of recoil. They don't actually reduce recoil at all, they just calm down the gun's little wobbles so the pattern feels slightly less chaotic. These aren't bad picks, they're just specialists. Bring them out when the job fits, otherwise stick with the heavy hitters. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. If you made it this far, you now understand recoil in a way most players never really think about, and that knowledge actually matters. If you want more breakdowns like this, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I really appreciate you being here. Have a great day. Goodbye.